Hello tout le monde. Hello everybody. I won't kick this off just yet, but looks like we're working finally. I think we're just going to wait for Nana to log in or for Marie-Ève.
Oui, donc on va attendre que Nana se joigne à nous. Ça ne devrait pas être bien long. Sinon, là, je vais... Ah, Nana est là, justement.
Ah! Donc, bonjour tout le monde. Bonjour tout le monde, désolée pour le délai. Un petit problème technique avec cette conférence ainsi que celle de la course sur route avec Marie-Lou. Donc, j'espère que vous allez bien. Juste à titre d'information, vu le petit retard qu'on a pris, nous allons prolonger la conférence jusqu'à 13h30. Si jamais on a lieu d'arrêter à 13h30. Bob, is that okay with you to stay a little bit longer until?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, great. Donc, Marie-Lou, à ce moment-ci, excuse-moi, Marie-Ève, désolée, j'ai comme le cerveau un peu... Marie-Ève, je t'inviterai à partager ta caméra. Je vous ferai grâce de toutes les explications au sujet des paramètres de la conférence. Donc, je pense que vous savez tous comment vous mettre en plein écran, comment vous mettre sur le muet. Donc, je vais tout de suite commencer par présenter nos deux invités, donc Marie-Ève et Bob. Donc, Marie-Ève, bienvenue. Vous connaissez Marie-Ève, mais je pense qu'elle mérite une petite introduction quand même. Bon, fait que Marie-Ève, comme vous le savez, a pratiqué l'athlétisme pendant plus de 20 ans. C'est une ancienne spécialiste de 100 mètres haies, puis elle a bien sûr représenté le Canada à 7 reprises sur la scène internationale. Puis elle est 4 fois championne canadienne universitaire. Maintenant, elle est entraîneur de sprint et haies à l'Université McGill depuis 2014. Puis elle siège à la commission technique de la FQA depuis 2019. Fait que bienvenue, Marie-Ève. Est-ce que ton audio est ouvert?
Oui.
Oui, parfait. Fait que, le rôle à Marie-Ève aujourd'hui serait de trier vos questions, de prendre vos questions pendant la présentation à Bob. Fait que je vous inviterai de soit écrire à Marie-Ève dans le chat public ou privé, c'est comme vous voulez. Marie-Ève, par la suite, trouver un bon moment pour interrompre Bob. Puis, à la fin de la présentation, bien sûr, on va vous inviter à, si vous voulez, ouvrir vos microphones puis poser des questions directement à Bob. Donc, Marie-Lou, est-ce que tu aimerais dire un mot de bienvenue?
Oui, bien, merci Nana. Bonjour tout le monde. J'espère que vous allez bien. Merci d'être avec nous. J'ai bien hâte d'entendre la présentation de Bob ce matin. Avant que Nana passe à la présentation officielle de notre invité, on voulait prendre un moment en fait pour vous offrir nos sympathies là, à la suite du décès de Frédéric Harlen. On trouvait ça important de le faire parce que Fred aurait définitivement été l'un des nôtres pendant cette conférence-ci. Il aurait contribué à la discussion, il aurait posé des questions, proposé probablement des pistes de solutions avec toute la passion qu'on lui connaissait. Donc, on tenait à lui divulguer nos pensées en ce moment. Puis Fred était un entraîneur vraiment dévoué, apprécié de tous. Il a inspiré beaucoup de monde, dont vous et moi, mais aussi des milliers d'athlètes. Donc, merci Fred, tu nous manques déjà, puis on a une pensée spéciale pour toi en ce moment.
Bon, je vais essayer de ne pas essuyer mes larmes. Merci beaucoup, Marie-Ève. Fred était un de mes bons amis, donc semaine très difficile. Merci pour ça. Donc, j'invite Bob maintenant. Merci, Bob. Bienvenue à nous autres. Bienvenue au Congrès annuel 2020 de la FQA. Donc, je vous présente Bob Westman. C'est une petite introduction pour Bob. Il s'est joint au personnel des entraîneurs d'athlétisme du Varsity Blues de l'Université de Toronto en 2009. Puis en tant qu'athlète, Westman était un sprinteur de 2001 à 2005, puis elle a reçu 12 médailles du SIC, fait anciennement U Sports pour les plus vieux. Maintenant U Sports, mais anciennement SIC, dont 4 médailles d'or. En 2018, il était entraîneur à domicile à l'Université de Toronto lors des championnats seniors du NACAC. Puis en 2019, il était l'entraîneur-chef de l'équipe des universiades d'été à Naples, en Italie, ainsi que l'entraîneur aux relais mondiaux à Yokohama, au Japon. Puis il compte parmi ses athlètes élites Sarah Wells, bien sûr l'olympienne demi-finaliste en 2012 aux 400 mètres haies, Alicia Brown, championat mondiaux, elle a été dans le fond participante aux championnats mondiaux en 2013, en 2019 aux 400 mètres, et Misha Powell, maintenant montréalaise, Misha Powell, olympienne en 2016 aux 400 mètres. Donc, petite information pour vous avant que je passe le micro officiellement à Bob. Bob a aussi vécu à Sherbrooke. Donc, il compte parmi ses amis Yves Roy, Rova, Richard Crevier. Donc, bien sûr, la présentation sera en anglais, mais n'hésitez pas à lui poser des questions, soit à vive voix, soit dans le chat en français. Bob va peut-être répondre en français, sûrement en anglais, mais peut-être en français. Mais n'hésitez pas à lui poser des questions en français. Il comprend le français oral, puis si ça lui tente, il va vous répondre en français. Donc, Bob, je t'invite maintenant. Bonne conférence à tous.
Thanks, Nana. Really appreciate it. If you can turn on the screen sharing, I'll get rolling.
Yes, that is one thing I did forget to do.
Yeah, no worries.
So I'm going to just stay on until you tell me that it works.
I think I have to start this presentation first. Okay. Can everyone see that?
Yep, looks good.
And what I'm going to do, I'm going to turn off my camera so that's blown up a bit more. Excellent. Perfect. Okay, so everything looks good?
Everything looks good.
Awesome. Okay, guys. I'm going to jump right in here. Today, Felix asked me to really dive into the 400 and 400 hurdles. So that's going to be the topic for today. I thought it would be good to give a little bit of background about myself. So Nana's already introduced a few of these things, just so you can understand a little bit about my coaching philosophies and where they've derived from. I think we all know that we have a coaching tree. We have people that we've learned from, athletes that we've been around. And for me, that's been highly influential on who I am today as a coach. So yeah, I grew up in Sherbrooke, Quebec. Without knowing it, I think I was kind of blessed with 3 really high-class coaches right out the gates. Kim Chapdelaine, Yves Roy, and Richard Crevier. Now that I'm a little bit older and I've been around, I can appreciate that a lot more. And some of my first training partners, they were really elite and world class. And when you're a 13-year-old, you don't understand how lucky you are to kind of be around some of these guys. Harry Sylvestre was long jumping 750. Alex Marchand was running 49.5 in the 400 hurdles and close to almost under 46 in the 400. Rova Rabamanjara under 50 seconds in the 400. Andrew Lissad running 780 in the 60 hurdles. And that list kind of went on. And it really established early on for me what kind of normal behavior should be, right? And I think I was pretty lucky in that sense to be around kind of athletes at that caliber when I was 13, 14, 15 years old. From Sherbrooke, I went on to school in London, Ontario. And there I was coached by a man named Jim Parker. And Jim was from the lineage of the East York Track Club, which I didn't know much about until he kind of told me about it. But it really was a hub for 400 and 400 meter hurdlers and 800 runners in the 50s and 60s. And that was where Bill Crothers, an Olympic silver medalist in the 800, trained back in the day. And Jim's programming was very different than Richard's. He was much more into the vein of kind of Clyde Hart and steady state racing. And the training was a lot more physiological in nature. Whereas with Richard, we did a lot more speed work. So very much a big contrast, but both programs had a lot of success. Now, my current context, I am at the University of Toronto. I work both with our varsity program and with a group of post-collegiate sprinters that are aiming for Olympics and Paralympics. So the big question that we're trying to answer today, okay, is how do we optimize programming for sprinting and hurdling for 45 to 60 seconds? Okay, so I really like to try and simplify things as much as possible. And the last part of that question is what's most important. It's that the time domain of 45 to 60 seconds complicates the answer. It's not just sprinting, it's not just hurdling, it's doing so under fatigue, right? So, and just kind of a note for today, I'm going to really talk generally about the 400 to begin with. And then from time to time, I'm going to split out the 400 hurdles and what kind of makes that event unique. But for the most part, I'm a big believer that what's really important for the 400 is going to be very important for the 400 hurdles. So there are just a few moments where there's some unique nuance to the 400 hurdles. So what plays a role in success for those events, right? We can look at things like speed, physiology, technique and tactics, psychology of the athlete, right? It's very, very multifactorial. And I think that's what really makes it interesting. Like the 400 hurdles, even the 600, 800, they're so multifactorial, and the weighting on the different things that go into it is very similar, I find. So it forces us to experiment quite a bit for what are the right doses of each of those domains for individual success. So I'm going to kick off with a little bit of an example, okay? Just to get us thinking about the event and to take a deeper dive into how some of the different factors get weighed in. Okay, so what you're looking at, and I think I'll suggest at this moment, you can either go full screen or make sure you blow this up so you can see some of the details. And hopefully my pointer's showing up here. But what you're looking at is a leadoff leg on a 4x4 relay, okay? Oftentimes when we're at some of the world championship events or world relays, they'll have the athletes wear a GPS unit, and that GPS unit tracks their velocity throughout the race. So this is a leadoff leg. So it will be coming out of blocks. On this x-axis, you have the distance into the race where they're at, and on the y-axis is their velocity kind of throughout. And it is really normal to see these undulations up and down. Obviously the GPS it's good, but it's not going to have continuous data going in, so it won't track kind of the immediate, it won't smooth everything out. And also we're dealing with humans, and sometimes they speed up a little bit, sometimes they slow down a little bit. And also some of the running happens on a corner, so there will be more adjustments to kind of continuous velocity. So let's take a look at this actual run. What you're going to see is a very gradual buildup, okay? Finally hitting a peak velocity right around, it says somewhere in between 70 to 80 meters right here, okay? From there, she holds that velocity very steady. So there is decelerating happening, but it's not too crazy. There's a little bit of a pickup right here, right around 260, 270, but the drop off is not very steep at all. The finish line's here, but this is a relay, so the pass is actually taking place here. So while there is this big drop off coming into the exchange zone, the baton's actually getting changed over somewhere right in around here. Okay. The differential on this run, so one of the things we're going to talk about quite a bit today is a differential. And we mainly look at a differential between the first 200 and the second 200 meter. So the differential on this run was 2.0 seconds, okay? Clyde Hart was one of the first people to drive home analyzing differentials. If you take a look at one of his athletes, Michael Johnson, he would often try and run between 1.0 to 1.5 seconds. So really, really small differential between the front half and the back half of the race. Now here's another run. This was the heats at the same championship, where you're going to see something quite a bit different. In this race, she hits the accelerator really hard and hits her max velocity right around the 40 to 50 mark, okay? And then throughout this race, it's a far more steep decline in velocity throughout, okay? In particular, these last like 40 meters, it's quite a bit more steep. In this race, the first one, she had a 2-second differential. And this one, it was a 2.6-second differential. It's not a huge difference, but a difference nonetheless, okay? So I'm going to save the suspense, and I'm going to let you know that this run here, was quite a bit faster than the first run. But we're going to zoom out, and we're going to take a look at the reasons why. So this was actually this second run, or sorry, the first run I was showing you was from the finals at World Champs in 2019, and she ran 52.62 out of the blocks, okay? It's not a bad run for her, but it was, I'm just going to say it was an average run on the season for her. What didn't work well compared to the other run was she was just not aggressive enough accelerating, okay? She hit 8.1 meters per second as a peak velocity. I know from testing that her max velocity on a straightaway without fatigue is somewhere around 9.2 to 9.3 meters per second. So she was a full meter per second below that. By the 200 meter mark, so at this point she's at 8.1. By the 200 meter mark, she has dropped down to 7.5 meters per second. So has not dropped down very much at all. And at the 300 meter mark, she's only dropped down to 7 meters per second. So she has not lost much speed throughout. So it's a very good example of a steady state race, okay? And her last 100 meters, she covered in 14.12 seconds. We know that when she's trying to run sub 52, we have to keep that under 14.3, 14.4 seconds. So it's a good finishing 100 meters, but you would expect that considering how conservative the opening was. Now let's contrast that to, this was her run from the heats, okay? And in this case, when she hit the accelerator so hard, she actually gets up to 9.1 meters per second, which was also on a corner, let's remember, as she's coming out of the blocks, which was so close to her actual max velocity. And when you consider that it was on the corner and from blocks, getting up to 9.2 to 9, or getting up to 9.1 meters per second is basically meaning she got going as fast as she could. By the 200 meter mark, she had dropped down to 7.5 meters per second. So it was quite a steep drop in that range. And then by the 300 meter mark, she's right around 7 meters per second or in thereof. And so the drop off kind of from 2 to 300 was pretty similar to the last race that we looked at. But the big difference was by getting going so fast, so early, she was able to cover the first 200 meters in 24.67 seconds versus only 25.28 in the other run. And that 0.6 of a second was the ultimate kind of difference in her total time. And even in this run, when she went out so much harder, she still covered the last 100 meters in 14.29 seconds, which was only 0.2 of a second slower than the first run. So kind of the takeaway from all of this was for her in terms of optimization, so long as she never hits this kind of critical tipping point where you can't recover from, the faster she could cover the first 200 meters, the better for her overall time, right? So I'm not giving this as an exact prescription on how to run a 400, but really just to kind of kick off the topic on all the factors that play into success in the event. So what I want to do is kind of highlight what those factors are, okay? And for a 400 runner or 400 hurdler, I see 4 major domains that we want to explore. That's physical, technical, tactical, and the psychosocial domain. I think it's important that when we're going to talk about programming, that we identify what are the things that are important first and foremost, and then we can actually look at how do we improve those domains. Because unless you know what are the things that are going to be both trainable and lead to success, then you really shouldn't be looking at what are the inputs for practice. So we're going to explore some of these different areas. So starting in the physical domain, okay? And I'm going to say this is our biggest area of focus. Every part of this is important. Every part of it is going to play a role, but I would definitely say the physical domain is the most important. And the biggest reason is it's impossible to set any of your other goals if you just can't physically do it to begin with, right? When we look back at that race from Alicia, if she wasn't capable of at least running 9.1 meters per second, she's never going to hit that speed in a race, okay? So that's why this physical domain kind of is going to govern a lot of what we do. So the first part of the physical domain I want to talk about is acceleration. Okay. And I see acceleration as really a two-headed monster. Okay. It is a huge factor in the entire, it isn't a huge factor in the entire race because it's really just going to represent 10 to 20% of a 400 or a 400 hurdles. However, like we saw in that last example, if you don't handle the acceleration zone correctly, it's going to be very difficult to recover from later on the race. You are only going to get slower from that point forward, right? You're going to hit a peak velocity and you might be able to hold it for a little bit, but you're only going to get slower over the course of the race. So it's really important you don't necessarily have to hit your absolute maximum sprint speed, but that you do approach it and you find out what are how much you want to approach it for every individual athlete. So acceleration is important. Okay. So you need to train it. And in Canada, it's always an interesting challenge on how we approach different elements of training, right? Namely because I'm looking out my window right now and I see a snowstorm. Like we've got some challenges we have to deal with. So personally, how I approach this, in the fall, I start working on acceleration 2 to 3 times a week. Okay. You really need to be able to accelerate well if you want to be able to sprint upright well later on. Okay. So right out the gate, we're doing acceleration work first day, first week, and throughout the week, we're doing it 2 to 3 times. Okay. Later on in the fall, when the weather's still nice, I actually pull back on acceleration just a little bit because I want to take advantage of the fact that we have an outdoor track and we can have these wider corners and it allows us to do some different things. So we pull back a little bit. We'll keep doing acceleration work, but just not in as high of a dosage because eventually we're going to be moving indoors, right? And the corners get tighter and we're on smaller tracks for the most part. So that's when I'll re-emphasize acceleration is once we've moved indoors. And we'll kind of stick with that throughout the winter, maybe get a bit more specific as we get into racing later on. But knowing full well that there's going to come a point in the spring where we're going to be back outdoors again, and then I can change focus. And once we're back outdoors, I don't stop working on acceleration. I just make it more specific, right? So now we're working on runs into hurdle 1 and hurdle 2, and that's our acceleration zone, right? Or we're working on a 400-meter acceleration where we're trying to see what percentage of their max velocity can we get up to safely in the race. So it just gets a bit more specific once we move outdoors. The next area I want to talk about is max velocity, okay? And there's a lot of different training inputs when you're starting to put together a program. But in my opinion, this is one of the most critical factors for any runner between 100 and 800 meters, okay? Max velocity or maximum sprint speed or peak velocity is pretty easy to define. It's basically the point where you're no longer accelerating. You've built and built and built and built, and eventually you're going to hit a peak. And you can only stay at in that window for a very small period of time before deceleration occurs because of fatigue. It might be 5 meters. It might be like 10, 20, 30 meters even. But eventually you're going to run out of the ability to accelerate, and that's when you've hit your max velocity, okay? What max velocity represents is how well an athlete can coordinate their movement, how much power they can express while coordinating that movement, and the direction of that power. So all these kind of different elements are going to play into that. And if you're going to be training max velocity, it generally means sprinting between 25 to 60 meters. That's the training zone for this. So one of the things that I've found, okay, is that improvements in max velocity are very closely paired with improvements in acceleration. And that's normally because what we've done is we've improved their neuromuscular coordination. So when we work on acceleration, we're improving their coordination, we're improving their body's ability to move through space. And conversely, it's actually going to help them sprinting upright, and vice versa. When we're working on upright sprinting, it's going to help their ability to accelerate as well. Okay. The other big door that working on max velocity opens is all the work that we're going to do at a sub-max level. Okay. So when you improve your max velocity, then every other aspect of working at a submax level was going to get better. So for example, let's just say that you felt the optimal percentage of your max velocity to race a 400 or 400 hurdle at is right around 94%. So if you, when you start the year, you're at 9 meters per second, and later on in the year, you're able to go 10 meters per second, that means that that 94% of the 9 or the 10 meters per second has gotten better. And vice versa, okay? The higher your max velocity, the lower percentage work rate you need to be if you're looking at a time or a speed goal. So maybe you say, we really need to hit the 200 meter mark in 24 seconds, okay? And you want to hold at that zone. Early on in the year, when you're starting your training, that might be that you have to work at 95 or 96% of your max velocity to hit that 24 flat. Whereas later in the year, as you've improved it, you're now working at a lower work rate. So 91, 92%, whatever it might be. So the bottom line on that is you get faster. Everything you're doing at a submaximal level gets easier, okay? So when you've actually improved max velocity and you've done some testing, okay, I find that it's showing 3 things in particular. One, that you've improved neuromuscular coordination, so their ability to move through space, okay? You've improved their power expression, so either maybe they're either simply stronger or maybe they're applying that force better, right? They're hitting better directions or they're better coordinated through their movements, or possibly their central nervous system is just feeling fresh and ready. Maybe you've given them some additional rest, okay? In any case, regardless of what the reason is that you've seen the improvements in max velocity, it is a clear indicator that that athlete is ready to race, okay? I have seen a correlation with every athlete I have coached that when we hit a 30 fly PB, that they are ready for a race PB to go along with it. And I've seen that in 60-meter runners, which would think is pretty intuitive, right? A 30 fly test is basically almost the same thing as a 60, but I've also seen it as far up as 800-meter runners, okay? And it's very directly coordinated. Next, along the physical domain, I want to talk about anaerobic speed reserve, okay? And this really encompasses a very wide range of training speeds, okay? So it's defined as the velocity zone that's between your max velocity or maximum sprint speed and the max velocity at which VO2 max occurs, okay? So I'm going to throw a nod to Gareth Sanford, who's originally from New Zealand, but now he's working out in BC for really pushing the standardization of that definition. So that way we can all kind of talk about the same thing. Within that zone, almost the entirety of submaximal training for a sprinter will take place, okay? So, and hopefully not too much below it. Like you really don't need to do a lot of aerobic work when you're putting together the programming. So what are you trying to achieve when you are training in this anaerobic speed reserve? One, physiologically, we're trying to teach the body to tolerate a certain level of stress for a certain amount of time, okay? So it's, if you send an athlete out to do a 400 on the first day of training, the body's just going to reject it, right? It's just going to say, oh my God, I am not ready for this. You have not built me up to tolerate this. So there is something related to the fact that you have to just get used to tolerating being under stress for 45 seconds, 50 seconds, 55, 60, depending upon what is the duration of your race going to be, right? The other thing we're trying to achieve by training in this zone is we want to train the body's efficiency on how it processes and spends energy. So that's the metabolic transaction. So you will actually get better kind of the more time you spend in some of these different zones, right? We're also trying to train the brain to ignore some of the signaling from the body, or at least delay it, right? When you are under that kind of stress for an extended period of time, your body's going to send your brain a message like, hey, I can't handle this. I'm overloading. You need to back off, right? We're not going to make it. You need to back off. And to a certain extent, you've got to be able to ignore that, or at least delay it, or maybe even reinterpret that kind of signaling of like, okay, when I'm 30 seconds into a race and I'm getting this messaging, it means I'm doing it right, right? So how we approach that is part of the training. And also when we're training in this domain, it allows us to work on some very specific race strategies. right? And we'll hit on a bit more of that when we get into race tactics a little bit later. Training in this zone can take any kind of form, okay? It could be something as simple as any of the repeat interval work, right? So maybe you're running 60-second intervals and you're doing that on repeat, right? So that's what this could look like. It can also be a 100-meter sprint at 95%, right? This is all stuff happening below your maximal sprint speed. And you just have to be able to understand what area of the race are you trying to work on. Are you trying to work on their tolerance for a certain amount of time? Then that interval training is really good, right? If you're trying to work on specific race strategies, then you want to be operating at a really high percentage with some long rest and things like that. Moving along the physical domain, I'm just going to talk quickly about power, because power is going to play a big role in sprinting, and it's also very trainable. So we want to improve it, right? Simply put, power is force times velocity, okay? And that's important to remember when it comes to how we're going to apply it to training, right? So we want to get stronger. Stronger is good, right? It's going to improve force. However, on the other side of the equation, displacement plays a role in velocity, right? So there is going to come a certain point where increases in absolute strength, which also often comes with increases in mass, are going to make us slower as opposed to faster. So there is a bit of a trade-off eventually. So you just want to be mindful of that. But you can also improve force, not necessarily by getting stronger, but by how you apply the force. And that's when we work on technique, right? So if the direction that you're applying force is the best direction, the optimal direction for defeating gravity, which is ultimately what we're doing when we're sprinting, then that can lead to improvements just as much as getting stronger will. So and we can actually, it's a good segue because we're going to talk a little bit about technique in the next slide. So I don't want to we could spend the entire presentation talking about technique. So I don't want to get too bogged down on this, but I think it's important to hit on and to go over at least a little bit. And we can talk more on it in the end in questions if people want to, but I'll just talk very quickly about this so we can kind of keep moving through stuff. First off, during acceleration, you want to key in on looking at shin angles and torso angles in particular. So an optimal launch angle as you're accelerating is 45 degrees from the ground. You're going to rise to 90 degrees. Okay, so the challenge you're trying to do is to get from that 45-degree position up to 90 degrees. The torso is going to trail your shin angles and how it comes up, not by much, just a little bit, but it will trail it a little bit. Kind of the key thing from this is don't get stuck too low, right? I've seen time and time again, sprinters kind of trying to stick into this model where they have to stay low for a certain amount of time, but don't fight physics, especially if you have a younger or weaker athlete. They're going to just rise faster than a stronger athlete, right? So if it seems like they're popping up and they're getting up too quickly, that's okay. That might be just what their body is capable of doing at their age and strength level. So you probably have seen things where they might say you should rise about 7 to 8 degrees in that shin angle or torso angle on every step. And that might be true for some, and that might be not true for others. So that's just something to kind of take a look at, understand the athlete that you're working with, and don't force them into a model that they're not capable of doing. The next thing to be looking at is their center of mass and how that's going to rise as they accelerate. So acceleration involves a lot of change. And in a race, they're going to come out of blocks and their center of mass is actually going to be pretty close to the ground. By the time they're upright, their center of mass is right around their belly button or just below. And so your challenge is to take it from close to the ground to up there in a very gradual, rhythmic fashion. So the way I like to teach kind of acceleration or to think about this is to actually work in reverse. Start with the easy things that they can grasp first and foremost, and then gradually actually lower the center of mass. So that might look like doing drop-ins or run-ins first. So there we have the center of mass already where it's supposed to be, and we have momentum behind the athlete. So it's pretty easy to work on acceleration as a drop-in or a run-in. Then I'll progress to something like standing starts, so we no longer get the momentum behind us. Then I might lower into something like a crouch, so we just lower the center of mass a little bit, and then eventually that'll flow into either a 3-point or a 4-point start, right? And finally, you'll have them coming out of blocks, and you'll have that complication of pushing off the foot pedals. The next thing I like to look at in terms of acceleration on technique is the rhythm or frequency on every step, on every kind of ground contact they're going to have. Initially, because they're starting at 0 meters per second, they have no momentum behind them, they're going to have larger ground contact times and have a slower frequency at the beginning. So it's going to sound like a slow clap. And then the frequency increases on every step from there, right? One of the kind of common things I see early on is people like to feel fast in those first few steps, and they might get quick, choppy steps. But this is a place where you're going to benefit more in terms of that trade-off between, ground contact time and fast frequency by applying more force early on, spend a bit more time on the ground, and project as you accelerate. So it should sound like a slower frequency and build up faster from there. Okay. Once you're upright, then the change has stopped for the most part, right? We go through a lot of change in how things are happening as you accelerate, but once you've hit that max velocity position and you're fully upright, now it should be more about repetitive, steady movements. They should look the same, as similar as possible, right? Arms should be swinging up and down, right? And your lower body is going to move like a piston in a motor, because that foot is going to come out behind you, but ultimately you want it to be able to swing back in front to strike down in a straight vertical fashion. So I like the analogy of thinking that the foot is a hammer. And if you have a hammer and it is hovering just above a nail, like an inch above a nail, and you try and swing it down to drive the nail in, it's not going to go very far, right? Versus if you have that hammer really high above the nail and you get to get some velocity behind it. So when you're bringing the foot through on the swing phase, you really want to have that foot as high as possible off the ground, okay? Now, the other thing that's critical and important when we think of that hammer and nail analogy is the direction that you hit the nail. If you hit it dead on and you drive it straight down, that nail is going to go right into the wood. But if you hit it off to the sides, right? So if you're losing energy out the sides or out the back, then it's not going to go down anymore. The nail's going to bend, right? So similarly, we need to get the foot in a position out front of the body that when you drive from the hip, it's going to go straight down and not out the back. So that is all a result of everything that happens before it. So it's great to say we want that knee in a thigh parallel position, and we want to drive the foot straight down and land just under our center of mass. But how it gets there is what's important. So kind of working backwards, okay? The foot, during the swing phase, that foot needs to travel over the opposite side knee, okay? So it needs to be in nice and tight to the glute as it's swinging through, okay? Now, in order for it to be able to get into that position, when it's still on the ground and you're about to go into a toe-off position, you need to initiate that movement from your hip and not your knee, right? So of these two joints, if you initiate movement in the knee first, you're going to see that flick that happens in behind, and the hamstring is going to start contracting first before you start moving from the hip. And everything just starts the process of kind of swinging through early. And ultimately, instead of the foot traveling over the knee, it's actually going to cross through the calf, and it's going to swing and open up, and it's going to be low. And then you're going to be forced to pull it back as opposed to push it in. So I'm not going to, I know it's hard to kind of visualize some of that verbally. If at the end we want to go over some mechanics, I got some things that I can show in some videos and stuff like that. But I'll kind of leave that there for the moment. And if you want more instruction on that, we can talk a bit more at the end. Okay, moving along, we'll actually talk a little bit now specifically about hurtling and takeoff and landing, okay? I'm not going to spend too much time here either, but let's just talk a little bit about hurtling. So number one goal in hurtling is to minimize the time spent over the hurdle, right? You just can't generate force off of air. You got to be in contact with the ground. But the small exception on occasion in a 400 hurdle. Okay, and when we get into talking about race tactics and race rhythm, we'll understand why that might be, why you might, instead of trying to get immediately back in contact in the ground, why you might on occasion want to float a hurdle a little bit and gain another few inches off that hurdle. I really like to preach and coach that we want to minimize any extraneous movements, in particular any twisting or limbs that they're either going across or away from the body as they're hurdling. Okay, and the reason for that is that when they're landing off the hurdle, you have to take time on the ground to counteract whatever movement has just happened in the air. Okay, so say we've all seen that 400 hurdler whose arms, as they're going over the hurdle, spread out wide like wings, right? And when they land, in order for them to be able to start sprinting again, they have to then take the time to recoup those arms underneath them and swing and then sprint off. And that could cost them either hundredths or tenths of a second on every single hurdle to counteract that movement, right? Similarly, if they have this kind of perfect hurdle arm where their fist swings right across their body to their opposite side shoulder, when they land, they have to take the time to not only swing that back down to their side, but then counteract the movement that they've just created through their upper body by swinging it back. So as a general rule, I obviously don't want their arms out wide, and I would rather that they focus on swinging down and not crossing the midline at all, right? As opposed to, you know, coming across in that hurdle arm and looking at their watch and putting it back in their pocket. It's important to note, okay, that in 400 hurdles, the hurdles are lower. They're 30 and they're 36. So we don't necessarily need to be perfect hurdlers. Being a better hurdler is better, okay? Don't get me wrong on that point. If you're a proficient hurdler, it's helpful. But there's a cost to the time that you invest in everything, right? And for me, I would much rather have a better 400 runner and a better sprinter than a better technical hurdler. Okay, so that kind of time change. So that doesn't mean don't spend time learning to hurdle. It just means it's not something you have to fixate on as much as in a sprint hurdle, for example. Okay. Another challenge that comes in the 400 hurdles is steering. So because we're now hurdling on a corner and a lot of our vectors are going to be pulling us out, right? It's going to be trying to pull us a little bit wide as you're going around the corner. You want to steer from the outside in as you approach the hurdle, okay? And that's why it's generally favorable to be a left leg hurdler on a corner, okay? It doesn't mean it has to be. It's just a little bit easier to navigate, and you're less likely to hook a trail leg around the outside if you do it that way and get disqualified. So an extension to that is the more proficient you can be with both legs, the better it is, the more options you have. It's probably unlikely that someone is going to be as proficient on both legs, right? In which case, then you're going to want to set up a step pattern, which is going to be optimal for whatever their dominant leg is, okay? So we're going to dive into that very, very shortly when we get into race tactics. So moving along, now on race tactics, we're going to start with race pacing, okay? And there are certainly optimal pacing strategies for a 400 and a 400 hurdler. You cannot simply just hit the gas the whole way through and try and run your best race. So there is going to be some pacing that's involved. But it's very individual. So you're going to want to experiment a little bit to find out what those optimal pacing strategies are. And not only is it individual, but it matters if you're indoors and outdoors, right? I have found differentials to be much higher indoors versus outdoors just based on the number of corners that are involved. So some things to consider, okay? How close to their max velocity should they get, right? In that first example we showed with Alicia, she was someone who's benefits when she gets close to her max velocity. Others are more successful when they have a slightly lower peak velocity in the race. So an example of that would be like Michael Johnson. He was fast. I mean, he ran 1932 in the 200 as well, but he ran his fastest times in the 400 when he was a fair bit backed off. So I think it's if you wanted to kind of look at those two examples of each other, Alicia, she's fast, but for an elite 400 runner, having a PB of 23.8 isn't as optimal as compared to some of the others. So for her, she needs to run close to her max velocity in order to even still just be in the race, and then rely on the fact that she has great speed endurance on the back end. For Michael Johnson, because he already had elite speed, he could work at a far more sub-maximal level and play it through. So if you have someone who is extremely fast, then you might be able to work at a lower sub-max speed and let them rely on having a stronger close at the end. It's something to play with, right? Something to think about. It's important that you track their splits for this reason, right? Get splits at 100 meters, 200, 300. I've found anywhere from 1 to 3 seconds could be where their optimal differential is between the opening 200 and the second 200 meter. And with the 400 hurdles, I think it's still important to watch those differentials, even though most of us end up using touchdown times, right, to look at their splits. Touchdown times, in case you don't know, so we start our watch as they're going, and we basically get a lap interval time every time their foot touches the ground off the hurdle, right? And that's going to give us 10 little mini intervals over the course of the race. So I think it's important to still get a 200-meter differential, right, in a 400 hurdle, and you can work it out. You can still just only get the touchdown times over the course of the race. Then you throw the times in a spreadsheet, and you can work out the differentials between hurdle 5 and hurdle 6, and still get a pretty close approximation of what their 200 split would be. What you're looking for is a place where a big drop off in velocity occurs. Okay, so if that big drop off in velocity happens at the 370 meter mark, that's fine. You can almost fall across the finish line at that point. If it's happening at the 290 mark, you're in trouble, right? So that's when you want to play with those kind of differentials and to see what's going to be optimal for someone. You also want to take into consideration the time of year. I've found that early on in the season, you're often going to see bigger differentials than you will later in the season. And that's because they're just not ready yet, right? They're going to get better. They're going to get faster. They're going to get fitter. They're going to get more accustomed to the shock of racing and other things that come along with that. So don't overreact if you do see 4-second, 5-second differentials early on. It might not mean that your pacing is wrong. It might just mean that it's early, right? Maybe your training is 80% of the way there, and that explains why they're hitting a massive wall at the 320 mark. Okay? And my personal experience has been you're better served continuing to practice and program for the pacing that you want to do, as opposed to the pacing that they're ready for in that exact moment. Okay. Think of it as like dress for the job that you want and not the one that you already have. So with that, set up your training to match the kind of pacing goals that you're looking for. I like to have a goal for the first 80 meters and a goal for the first 2 hurdles. I like having a goal for the 200-meter mark and hurdle 5. And I like having a goal for the 300-meter mark and hurdle 8. Okay. One of my favorite spring workouts is 300 plus 120. Okay. Or 8 hurdles plus a 120. You've set out timing goals throughout the race that they're trying to hit, some very specific race pace goals for the first 300 or the first 8 hurdles. Then they get a 30-second rest, and then they're going to hammer a flying 120 with whatever they've got left. Okay. And I like this because, one, you're executing a race plan. And if it's in the spring, it's right around the time you're going to start racing specifically again. So you get a chance to work on these different things. You get a chance to practice to see, hey, I think we're faster. So I think these should be good race goals for us for this year, and see how those work out. Gives them a chance to see what it feels like and to execute that. And then it still gives them a chance at the end to try and hit that physiological zone that will resemble the end of a race, but still be a little bit more workable with that flying 120. Okay. If you want to do multiple runs in a practice of this, you need to draw back the race distance in the first portion from say a 300 to a 250, or from 8 hurdles down to 6 hurdles, because they're going to have residual fatigue off that first run, and they just won't be as sharp as they're trying to reattempt something that's pretty specific. Okay. On the other side of kind of race tactics is race rhythm, and this is a concept for a 400 hurdler. Okay. When we're looking at race pacing, that's us zooming out. Okay, we're looking at it from afar and we're saying, okay, what's the best way to use your energy over the entire course of the race? But in the race itself, when we zoom in for a 400 hurdler, they're going to need to focus on their step pattern, because there is a hurdle every 35 meters that they're going to have to navigate. So that's what they're going to want to zoom in on, and to get a rhythm for their race. So we want to optimize a plan for the athlete. Okay. If they happen to be perfectly equal with both legs, then you can really focus on their left leg and having that come up around the corner. Okay. It's rarely going to be the case that they're going to do that, in which case they're going to have a dominant leg. And I find it's often preferential to set up a race plan where they're going to be on their dominant leg as often as possible. Okay. So simply put, if they have an odd number step pattern, you're going to be on the same leg. If you're going to be on an even number step pattern, you're going to be switching. If you look at Karsten Warholm or Edwin Moses, they just stay on 13s the whole way. So they're on their left leg and they just stay on the same pattern the whole way through. Okay. But for the most part, most hurdlers, especially age class hurdlers, are going to check down multiple times over the course of a race. Okay. Checking down means you've added a step, which then ultimately means you're going to start having to play with that step pattern a little bit. So I'm going to use an example first, and then I'm going to tell you a little story to kind of go with it. So this example is a female 400 hurdler, and she was right leg dominant. Okay. At first, she was pretty elite. When we first started to try and play with 15 steps, because all the elite hurdlers were at least using a 15-step pattern, she just always felt it was too fast and too hard for her to do, right? She could do it, but it meant really committing, over-committing to her race pace. And she would be going out too fast and too hard, and it wasn't leaving enough energy on the back end. So we put aside 15 steps, and we said we were going to always use 16 steps out the gate. So in the early season, okay, she would be able to go out to hurdle 5 on 16 steps, and then she would check down on when we got to hurdle 6, you can go to 17 steps. And since she was right leg dominant, that would mean that point when we were about to go around the corner on 17 steps, we would want to try and make sure we lined up with a right leg going around that second corner. Okay. So the pattern of how that would look, this pattern that I'm showing on here is later in the season, we would go out to hurdle 6. So she would make sure she's on hurdle 1 with her left, hurdle 2 with her right, hurdle 1 with her left, hurdle 3 with her left, hurdle 4 with her right, hurdle 5 with her left, and then hurdle 6 with her right again. And then once she was on a 17-step pattern, that would mean she'd be on rights around the corner. Okay. Now, checking down is tricky. You're adding in a step, right? So what you're frequently going to see is someone, if they're not doing it intentionally, stutter into a hurdle. They just get this feeling like they're too far, and then they end up chopping their steps, losing velocity, and hurdling with the other leg. Okay. Now, if you plan for it and it's something that you build into your training, what I found to be more preferential than chopping into the next hurdle is that immediately when you come off the hurdle that you're going to check down after from, you take a couple quick short steps, and then you're able to run naturally and carry your velocity better into that next hurdle. Okay. And you're going to get clues from this from the athletes themselves when they're going to tell you, I feel like I'm in between on this hurdle. Like I can get there, but I have to bound, right? I really have to reach, right? Or if you see them stuttering, you're going to get an idea of where the places are they're going to need to check down. So, and then for Sarah, so the athlete in question here that I'm talking about is Sarah Wells. After we've done that check down, she's gone around the corner using her rights. She was going to still need to check down again. And that was either going to happen on hurdle 9 or hurdle 10. When she was in the most control, right, we found that intentionally checking down on hurdle 9 was the best for her, because it meant she got to do hurdle 9 with her left, but then hurdle 10 when she was most fatigued with her right, leaving her in a better position to run off that hurdle into the finish line. Okay. The other thing we knew with her touchdowns was that early on in the race, she's going to hit somewhere around 4.1 seconds between the hurdles. Okay. And throughout the race, it only gets slower. If we could keep her touchdown under 5 seconds by the time we got to hurdle 8, then she could run sub 56. That was pretty much our prescription for being able to run a sub 56 run, is to stay under a 5-second hurdle touchdown until at least hurdle 8, right? That was how aggressive the first bit had to be for her, and how we could spend the energy as good as possible. So a little story to kind of work with this now. 2015 Pan Am Games were in Toronto. She was having a great season. And this race plan in particular, she had memorized. She could do it in her sleep. She knew exactly where her feet needed to be on the track at all times, more so than any athlete I've ever coached. Okay. Now, we show up at this event, biggest race of her life, and there were ridiculous winds on the first corner and on the backstretch. Okay. And in the heats, she got knocked completely off her race plan. She ended up using her non-dominant leg on 8 of the 10 hurdles. So we're debriefing that night, and jokingly she said, why don't we flip your blocks? And we kind of thought about it for a second and realized that was crazy. We haven't practiced that race plan in months. We haven't even practiced like switching your blocks and coming out of that way to even just see, could we easily get on the other leg? So we kind of put that aside. She comes out for the finals. They bring her out. She sets her blocks like normal. She does a run on one hurdle, and she feels the wind again. And she walks back. She flips her blocks and stands behind them. Okay. The long story short, she runs the race plan perfectly. So this new race plan, where instead of going out to hurdle 6, she only went out to hurdle 5. She intentionally checked down. She didn't fight the wind. And she ended up hitting this kind of exact perfect race plan, except kind of the last few hurdles. She didn't, because she now had the tailwind on the home stretch. She ends up only checking down on hurdle 10. It catches her off guard, but she gets it done anyways. She wins a silver medal. Really, really great. But what was most impressive about it, okay, is that she was only 6/10, because she made this kind of last minute change, and she understood the race and the tactics behind it, and not just how hard to run. She ended up only running 6/10 off her personal best, when almost every single person in that race was at least 2 seconds slower, right? Because that's how bad the winds were. So the lesson from all this, and the reason why I tell that story, is you can gain a pretty serious strategic advantage by just understanding the technical elements of the 400 hurdles, right? And how to navigate that kind of step pattern in between, and understanding your athletes, and most importantly, that they understand what's going on and why they're changing down, or why they might bound into a hurdle, so that way they don't have to change down to the next one. All right, so the last domain we're going to talk about is the psychosocial domain. Okay, so yeah, a lot of different components kind of go into this, and it's important and very different than anything else we've talked about. So first off, personal and environmental support, very big topic, can have a big impact on their success. First thing I'm going to say, you as a coach cannot be everything for an athlete, right? It's not healthy. It's not even possible. So it's important that you have people that support you and them that are going to be integral to their success. Okay. But we know there's a cost to everything. So it doesn't have to be perfect. Okay. At the most basic level, I want the athletes to have an understanding of self-care and recovery, right? That's my starting point. Can they do the things off the track that are going to help them to be successful for their next practice, right? And that doesn't cost much at all. After that, if you have a functional integrated support team, that is really helpful, okay? So whether that's strength and conditioning coaches, mental performance coaches, manual therapists, whatever it is, That can be super, super helpful. One of the kind of lessons I've learned later in my career is the more you let them be good at their job, the better it is for everyone. Okay. And that's taken me some time as a coach to as a coach, you really want to control a lot of things, but it's taken me a long time to really get to a place where it's like, find the people that you trust and let them do their jobs, and it ends up with the best possible outcome. And at the end, if you guys want to talk more about like how to really implement these things into a practice, how do you integrate them, whether it's a strength and conditioning coach, the mental performance coach, or the manual therapist, happy to talk about that. We can kind of go into more detail about it. The next element of support is emotional support. Okay. Do they have friends and family that support their journey? Right. And conversely, are there people in their support structure that are causing more harm than they're helping? Because it's really important that you get those people on board, right? You don't want to just exclude them, right? And that's like when they have a parent who is really overbearing and they show up at the race, and as soon as the race is finished, they're asking like, why'd you do that? And things, right? It's important that you're figuring out how to get them on board, as opposed to suggesting that parents just don't come at all, right? Because it's making the athlete nervous. So you want to create a shared vision with them, right? Get them on board, find a way that they are aware of like kind of what you're trying to do and what some of those unhealthy behaviors are. And that's going to be way more important, okay? Because at the end of the day, the athlete is going to need them on their journey. Right? They need to feel like people want them to be successful in the things they're doing, and they're not doing things in spite of someone else. So it's a long journey. There's going to be a lot of pitfalls. So having some emotional support, really, really important. Okay. And the other level of support is financial support. Always an issue, right? You can draw up the perfect plan, training camps, IST, all kinds of great things, but if they can't afford it, it doesn't work. Right. So that almost has to be one of the first things that you would sit down and chat about is what's financially feasible, right? And build the program around that. Or if you have things that are currently out of, financial grasp, then you have to say, okay, we really want to do this training camp in March. Let's figure out ways we can fundraise for it now, right? This is what these things are going to cost. And that helps keep everything in the program realistic. And on the psychology side of things, okay? First off, personality type can really dictate how you're going to actually build a race plan for a 400 or 400 meter hurdler, right? Get an understanding of who you're working with. Are they easily excitable? Are they aggressive? Do they struggle with focus? Don't fight that. Like, that's their nature. So let them capitalize on those strengths. Build a plan where they can be more aggressive early, and provide a lot of opportunities in training where they're going to be battling at the end of a race, right? So you're not going to get a perfect race plan out of this type of personality, right? So don't force that on them. You can have some general guidelines, but you just have to then make sure that in their programming, they're doing a lot of physiological work that are going to allow them to feel comfortable at the end of a race when they might be a bit more tired. On the other hand, do you have someone who's a deep thinker, a little more cerebral? Are they focused and patient, right? This is someone who probably benefits from having a balanced race plan where they're trying to hit goal times throughout the workout, right? And these people, you want to give them opportunities in practice to practice race execution, right? Let it be repetitive. Let it feel second nature for them. And then moving along, as we're talking about kind of the psychology, I'm a big believer in immersion therapy and how it can be applied in both kind of coaching and your programming, right? All the athletes we coach have some different forms of anxiety that they're going to bring out whether it's in training or in competition, right? And when you have that anxiety, they're either going to be faced with a choice of avoiding it or approaching it, right? And generally speaking, our instinct tells us to avoid. So first step for us as a coach is becoming aware of what are the elements, whether it's in competition or training, that bring on their kind of high levels of anxiety. Then I'd want to involve them in the process and be like, hey, I've seen this in you quite a bit, right? And get them bought into the idea that if they start to confront some of those anxieties as opposed to avoiding them, they're going to gradually desensitize to it and become less and less anxious about it, right? This isn't something you can secretly trick them into doing it, because they have to consciously be approaching these things on race day. So they need to know what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it. And then hopefully those kinds of skills and feeling, right, they'll be able to apply when the situation arises again. So here's some examples to think about for what I'm talking about, right? Maybe they feel a lot of social pressure from competing, right? I don't want people to think I'm slow, right? There's a social currency that comes from sport, right? And we're often afraid of being devalued. So instead of, it might cause them to just not want to do it at all, because they'd rather people wonder if they're fast or not, as opposed to being devalued. So a way to kind of work on this in practice might be just creating more opportunities within that practice to post and share results among your teammates, right? Expose them to the performances of themselves to everyone else and everyone else to them. And they're going to start to see that there's going to be times when everyone will be successful. And then there's going to be times when anyone can struggle, right? And we don't always get to see everyone else's struggles. We just see everyone else being successful most of the time, especially on social media. So the more exposure they have to seeing their own struggles, other people's struggles, it might desensitize that a little bit. They might also be worried about kind of how physically hard a race is, right? I might die if I go out that hard, right? So, and that's pretty common that you hear that, especially when you're trying to implement a new race plan. So you have to find a safe way to introduce that race strategy to them, right? So an example might be, so say you're trying to put in a 400-meter race plan that they're a little bit worried about. First, have them do 250 meters of that race plan. And they're going to say, well, yeah, that's easy. Like, that's not the part of the race I'm worried about. Like, that's fine. Just do it. And once they can do that, maybe have them go out to 300, right? And then once they can successfully do that, maybe it's a 320. And then it's a 350, and then it's a 370. And maybe by the time they've hit the 370, they're a little bit desensitized to it, but they're still hitting a wall. And at that point, you can basically say, look, I realize the 370 isn't a 400, but you can pretty much fall across the finish line from there, okay? Another thing that I find comes up, right, is they worry about failing when it matters most. They're worried about the pressure at big competitions. And this is really hard to duplicate because those big moments, they're not that frequent. So we have to find ways to create stress in practice, right? Or to seek out other competitions that would be a different major challenge for them to just get exposure to that level of pressure again, right? And if they're aware that they have, been exposed to that level of pressure and maybe they've overcome it in those moments, then it should help to kind of ease the tension and anxiety for when, the big moments come up. I've done it before, I can do it again. So just a couple examples of different ways that you can help kind of immerse the athletes in the things that bother them ahead of time. Merci beaucoup. Thank you guys for tuning in. Yeah, and I'll just kind of hand this back to Marie-Ève now.
Yes, we have two questions. So the first one is from Nana. I'm bringing you back to the first portion of your presentation. So what's the acceleration distance for a 30-meter flight test?
Okay. One sec, I'm just turning on my camera here. All right, so what we use is we do a 30-meter buildup and then the 30-meter fly. There's a bunch of different ways you can test max speed, max velocity. So we use a 30 plus 30. Sometimes it will give the athletes the choice that they could start at 20 meters. They could start anywhere between 20 to 30 meters. That's up to them to try and make it optimal. My goal, okay, is for them to hit their peak velocity at right around the 45-meter mark. So in between that 30 to 60 zone. So that way we have kind of an optimal zone where their max velocity is occurring, right? If they start too early, if they start at the 20 in a lot of cases. So the athletes might think that that full 60 is too far and they're going to lose too much speed. So they'll start at the 20. I find they hit their max velocity past the 45-meter mark later in the zone, so or like past the 15-meter mark of the actual time zone, and they're hitting their max velocity at like say 20, 25 meters, and they were still actually accelerating for a good portion of that time zone. The reason why I use 30 meters to time instead of 20 or 10 is the number is just bigger, right? So most of the timing devices we're going to use, whether it's timing gates or free laps, they have a margin of error, right? So if you say you want to do a 10-meter fly and you really want to try and capture it without having any fatigue built in, then that margin of error might encompass any change you're going to see anyways. So 20 meters, I think, is better than 10. My personal preference is 30 meters. I just find it's a big enough number that it's going to wash out the margin of error. And if you get them lined up properly, you're going to still see their max velocity in that zone.
Thank you. We have another question from Alfredo. You didn't mention much anaerobic lactic training. Is this something you purposely train, or it's something that comes from developing anaerobic speed reserve? How about aerobic training?
Yeah, I think that's more just a definition thing. So yeah, we will train it, and that falls under the whole zone of anaerobic speed reserve. Like that, everything kind of falls within there. So yeah, we certainly will train it, and just kind of speaking generally, I'm going to work on that a lot more later in the season. So I might be doing stuff at kind of the bottom of the anaerobic speed reserve zone, so like further away from maximum sprint speed, and at the same time be working on maximum sprint speed at the same point, and then kind of narrow in at that place where the kind of anaerobic alactic work comes in as well.
OK. Je veux juste vous dire que vous pouvez aussi poser vos questions en français si jamais vous n'êtes pas à l'aise de les poser en anglais. Là, je vais pouvoir traduire sans problème. Il va y avoir d'autres questions probablement, mais pendant qu'il n'y en a pas, je profite de te remercier, Bob. C'était vraiment, vraiment intéressant. I really like that story about Sarah Wells.
Yeah.
It really shows that we have to educate the athlete, tell them why, when, how, like explain everything so that in situation of stress or pressure, they can handle it by themselves, right?
Yeah. I was sitting in the stands. I wasn't even in like a warm-up area or anything like that. So I'm just sitting in the stands and saw her flip the blocks, and I just started laughing, frankly. So, whatever happens, happens,
Another question from Nana. Do you train hurdle rhythm indoors? And how to, probably?
No. So I'll say I don't train hurdle rhythm indoors, but we do train just because it's impossible to get anything kind of specific indoors. But we will do 4-step work, so getting some work on both legs. And occasionally, sometimes about once every 4 to 6 weeks, if we're going to do some type of like special endurance type training, I might throw some randomly spaced out hurdles, something where they're not trying to key in on a specific rhythm, but that their brain has to recognize, okay, I've got a hurdle coming up. There's a certain amount of distance between me and the hurdle. I'm going this certain velocity. I have to prepare to hurdle. I'm going to end up on my right leg or my left leg. I want their brain to start having to figure out these things. So I wouldn't call it rhythm, but we would do some non-specific work just to get them, get their brain thinking about like what happens as I approach a hurdle fast.
Okay, and I have a question. Have you ever coached 300-meter hurdlers? Is that a thing in Ontario?
Yeah, so early on, yeah. So, and it's a very interesting event because different places do it differently. So if you're in the U.S. in particular, I'm not sure what spacing Quebec will use, but the U.S. spacing, they want to keep they use an entirely different set of marks, okay, versus Ontario. So in Ontario, if I remember right, you have a short approach into hurdle 1, and then you're on the 400 hurdle marks from there. In the US, you have something like a 50 or 55 meter acceleration zone before the first hurdle, and then you're staying on 35 meters from there. So it ends up being like 5 meters off the mark or something. So I just remember there's different places on it. And I most likely, right, the age class that you're working with on a 300 hurdles is very young. So the training that they're going to do, whether in that anaerobic speed reserve, will be proportionate to where they're at in their development. So it should just kind of naturally work together without having to like think about doing a shorter proportion on speed endurance or anything like that.
We're talking about it right now, but someone is asking, your presentation was about elite athlete, most of it. Is it the same thing for midget or youth athletes?
Yeah, so I would say almost certainly. So what I wanted to do was not necessarily, I used kind of elite examples, but more so to show you what things are important. So the same things are going to be important for midget or youth athletes in terms of like, be fast first and foremost. Whether you're a 400 runner or 400 hurdler, you are not capable of doing things you're not capable of doing. So if you can't hit certain speeds, it doesn't matter how fit you are. So be fast first and foremost, right? And with a midget or a youth athlete, okay, you're going to have a finite amount of practices over the course of the week. You're not going to work out 4 or 5 times, or at least hopefully not. So you got to make choices in your programming. So maybe every single day you have a little bit of speed work in there, right? And then you can kind of focus in on other things after that. So hopefully the takeaway you have from this is the things that I said were important. Those 4 domains, they're as important for a 13-year-old as they are for a 25-year-old. Things in the psychosocial domain, same thing. Like family support is as important there as with anyone else. Speed work, everything. So maybe the one difference is you don't have to spend quite as much time working on a race pattern.
Yeah, that's
right?
what I was gonna ask. When does tactics come in place, or number of steps and stuff like that?
Yeah, when they're ready. Sorry, that's a horrible answer, but it won't be right away, certainly. I would avoid having athletes count their steps and let them just more or less figure it out. If they understand that, okay, I hurdled the first hurdle with my left leg, I hurdled the second hurdle with my right leg, so I did an even number of steps, and they can walk back and say, okay, I think I did that too slow, so I probably took 2 extra steps and wasn't on right, and like they can get some reinforcement on that. If I've seen too many times where I was like, what were you thinking about? I was trying to count my steps, so I wasn't really thinking about anything. I find that gets in the way more so than anything, but just have an understanding of kind of like what might be going on with the race. So is there an exact time to work on race tactics? No, but you'll know as a coach where it's like, okay, they're getting better, but they're just now consistently going out way too fast and blowing up. Okay, so let's dive into that a little bit and let them understand it. And that might be a great time to introduce the concept of differentials and things like that, to get them to be bought in of like, oh, you're saying I could be a half second faster if I just go slower? Okay, let me try it, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, to each their own.
Mm-hmm.
One question about the technique. So can you expand a little bit more on the technical over the hurdles?
Sure. We'll start with an assumption of basic hurdle technique, okay? That they're going to take off. They're going to lead with their knee as opposed to with their foot, and that you're trying to minimize the time that they're spending in the air, and they're trying to get back down to the ground. The part I was talking about with a kind of extraneous movement is that once they're in the air, and I'll start with just like an arm swinging across the body. So they have this lead arm, they have leaned into it, and they've come across. And now when they're about to land, they're swinging this around, okay? Maybe it's super tight and they're not going to move their torso, and they're able to put it right back in their pocket, and that's great, and we haven't created much extraneous movement. Most of the time, they're going to get tired every hurdle that they keep going, and it's going to start getting a little bit wild. And so they've hit the ground, and you've now seen this twist. So they've hit the ground, and they have to spend time amortizing on the ground to come back, okay? So I try and just simplify the motion that with that lead arm, they're just going to punch forward and sweep down, okay? And that's how they're going to match that lead leg, punch forward and sweep down, and it tends to create less opportunity for movement, especially as they get tired late in the race. The other thing you can see happen, they get nervous, arms actually come away from the body. Same thing that when they land, they have to take a moment to regroup their arms and swing up. So anything where you're seeing limbs move across or away from the body, that you want to minimize, right? And the part I was talking about in terms of, sometimes you don't want to minimize the time in the air, you actually want to float. So let's just say now we're getting into tactics, it's a more advanced athlete, and you want them to stay on a certain race pattern. But by hurdle 4 and 5, they're starting to have to reach a little bit. Well, that's an opportunity for them to float the hurdle a little bit, and maybe they gain an extra 6 to 8 inches off the hurdle that they can push into the next one, right? Now, there's going to come a point, you really float it, you're just losing velocity and it's not going to help you. So there is a tipping point on that. You can gain a little bit, but you can't gain a ton. But sometimes an extra 6 inches is exactly what you need to be in the right takeoff position for one more hurdle before you have to check down.
Good. When you start to focus more on lactic training, how much week of training do you think is enough to get used to that part of the race and be race ready?
Yeah, good question. So with a lot of things, once we were kind of into like a more specific zone, it's very individual, but I would say anywhere from 6 to 10 weeks, right? You can introduce something before they're ready, like say 6 weeks before, and that kind of buildup will go. I also won't do, so something like that 300 plus 120 workout, I won't do that every week. You can probably get away with it with 2 weeks in a row. If you try and push a third big effort like that even if you're just doing it once a week, I find you try and push on the third one, you're just going to start seeing diminishing returns.
It's very demanding.
Yeah, it's the same thing as racing, right? So if you did a competition every week, you could probably pull it off for 2 weeks in a row. That third week might be a bit of a struggle. So, and if you have competitions that you're also working around, it's hard to still have that kind of very specific endurance workout as well. So, yeah, I'd say anywhere from 6 to 10 weeks is where the zone will be. Derek Evely's often talked about like every athlete's going to have like kind of like a time to peak threshold, right? And for someone that might be like 18 total weeks, and so you bank in say 8 weeks of your general prep and things like that. So you'll start to get a feeling from people, but once I've introduced kind of the more specific work, race specific work, anywhere 6 to 10 weeks seems to be just about right.
And when the season has started, do you keep on doing these type of training?
Early on, yes, but that's going to get replaced with races, right? So the races are the best training ultimately. So it's different. With a varsity athlete, we're kind of forced into a model where there's going to be this competition here.
Every weekend.
Yeah, and with like a youth athlete or a post-collegiate athlete, you're probably going to have less of that. So you have more opportunity in training to implement these things.
Okay, another question. I have a 16-year-old athlete who is doing 400 meter and 800 meter. He is starting to do a bit of 400 meter hurdles. What pair of spikes should he use if he only buy one?
Yeah, sprint spikes. You can put a small amount of heel on it. So I've coached a bunch of 400, 600 runners, 800 runners. And even for them, they would still feel most comfortable in their racing in their sprint spikes. And especially if you want to work backwards, the kind of less of the heel drop, the better.
And I had a question. I didn't forget, Nana, your question. Right now, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Right now in Montreal and most part of Quebec, we can't really train on a track or even with a coach right now. We're very restricted. What can an athlete, a 400-meter athlete, can do at home to stay motivated and in shape?
Yeah, great question. So in fact, I'm locked down as of midnight tonight too. And we're going to be locked down again too. So, and we have a similar restriction, no in-person coaching, nothing like that. So I'm going to go back. I'm about to go back to April myself, but going back to what we did in April, I ended up feeling really good about it because we didn't know. My first time doing this too, right? Everyone's first pandemic.
Yeah.
So the one thing I knew, and I was talking with a chiropractor buddy of mine that lives out in Edmonton, was that we wanted to keep tendons and muscles loaded no matter what. So we hopped on Zoom 4 times a week, and we were doing plyometrics in our living room, drop squats, split lunge drops where you have kind of like a rear elevated position. You kind of jump up with one foot and you land on that one leg. We just did a bunch of stuff to just keep some plyometrics built in, because we knew that there is a point where we're going to come out of this and we're going to want to be training and sprinting. And if we don't do that, you're going to get injured quickly, right? Those are the things that are going to kind of roll down a little bit. I saw some great stuff online from a strength and conditioning coach named Alex Natera. So you guys can look him up, last name Natera, where he really preached a lot on, in terms of loading. When we're doing living room workouts, you want to start loading in a unilateral sense. So you're not going to be able to get a barbell and put 400 or 500 pounds on it. But if you start doing some pistol squats or we call them squat lowers, where you stand on the couch or you stand on the coffee table, you put a backpack on that has maybe 20 kilos in the backpack. It could be just textbooks. And because you're now not loaded bilaterally, you're not loaded with both legs, having that single leg doing most of the work, it actually ends up being, you can go, it's like you're taking away, when you're loading bilaterally, it's like 40% of what you would do unilaterally. So you put 20 kilos in a backpack, it's kind of the equivalent of like more like 50 kilos. So anyways, we did a lot of that stuff as well. And, you know, if push-ups aren't enough, then you start throwing in some plyometric push-ups and you're starting to load a bit more through there too. Anyway, so the long story short is I did the same thing, probably as just about everyone else. We did very frequent Zoom circuits, and we just tried to get creative, and we really wanted to load. So it wasn't about fitness as much, like, yeah, you're going to get some continual, oh, this is going to pop off from time to time, I think.
Oh, I can't see you right now.
Yeah, it shuts off for whatever reason. It must get warm or something. Anyways, it wasn't about kind of like the continual fitness, but that, you know, plays a part of things we want to do, not just for physical, but for mental health. But there was a lot of loading that you can do. Water, like jugs of water, really great. If you want to add things that are heavy, fill it with water, right? Not only there's the perturbations of controlling something that's filled with water, but also water is just heavy. So it's a good way to add weight to things. So.
Good idea. Thanks for sharing. Nana wanted to ask a question. Go ahead, Nana. Or not. Nana, are you there? Okay, then what about the second part of my question? What about the motivation? Like what tricks? I know the Zoom is a good one because you can see them, they can see the group. There's a human factor. Is there anything else?
Are they allowed in Quebec to get together, like still even in small groups, 5 or 10? So not at all. So
no, not right now.
Yeah, we're allowed groups of 10 outside. So anyways, having each other is really important. So that if you have to keep it virtual, do other things. There's a couple different game apps that we found, Scriblio and things like that. Things that just keep them engaged, and especially the people that don't want to do it, because those are probably the ones struggling the most, right? They don't want to do it. They're feeling depressed and unmotivated. And for their mental health more than anything else, try and get everyone involved, even if that means like, hey, we're going to bribe you. Someone here is going to win a chocolate bar by doing this, or whatever it might be. Yeah, try and get everybody out to, if it's not the physical part of the activity, something else as well.
And we have probably one of the last question about aerobic training. How much is too much? Example, volume per session and the number of sessions per week.
For aerobic?
Aerobic.
Yeah.
Aerobic.
Yeah. So we would do almost none, if I'm going to speak frankly. Maybe in the fall when you're first getting started, you can do a little bit of aerobic work. I've seen that kind of commonly done, so I don't want to I don't want to say like you never do it, that kind of thing. But certainly it's got to be a very low point of emphasis. But you know what, here we are, we're in a pandemic and maybe you can't do anything else. So if it's during the pandemic and you got to go out for a 20-minute jog, that's just great too.
Better than nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
Nana,
sorry, my microphone wasn't working before. Just to say, in reference to your last response, I was wondering what you thought about Karsten Warholm's kind of a decision to go on the bike in between two important meets this summer and not being worried about kind of a physiological decrease preparing for the next meet, and what you think, how you think that can translate to maybe our training this winter. Could we think of maybe buying an indoor bike or putting our road bike on rollers this winter? And I also have another question after that, which has nothing to do with your response for this.
So maybe just help me out. I don't know this story. Did he do it between races or is he just doing it through the break?
So he did it between races because he wouldn't have access to a track, but he was actually thinking of kind of continuing with that philosophy.
Yeah, so you're not going to detrain that much. He raced almost every weekend. You're not going to detrain that much in a week. So just hopping on a bike, that's probably just more for his mind or whatever. Yeah, it's perfectly okay. Like those guys, I got to spend a little bit of time one time with Kim Collins, who is a sprinter from St. Kitts and Nevis, and he sprinted into his 40s. And he was telling me about how he would go on the circuit, in the European circuit. He might race 40, 50 times in a summer. And he said, I don't really train. I'll go to the track, I'll warm up, I'll move around, but like the racing's my training. So for Karsten Warholm to go do something massive, like one time he did 4 hurdles, tried to almost broke the world record, and then came back and ran a 400, right? Like a couple hours later. That's enough work to last him just about a week, right? That's just fine. So we don't have to worry about that kind of detraining. Athletes are probably likely to worry about those things. When you are tapering, I didn't touch on tapering at all in this, but when you're tapering and you're trying to get them to do almost nothing, it's like asking for the world. So giving them that bike might be just the right answer. But yeah. So there's nothing there. But I do like there will come a point, and if he just wanted to ride a bike all winter, he would certainly start to detrain from there. But
so if I wouldn't find a solution that I was thinking of was asking them to get like an indoor cycle so I could program on the cycle. But you're saying that wouldn't be a viable option, like a viable alternative to a track.
Well, yeah, but it's a pandemic. So like, to be honest, yeah, I think if they had that, that's great. That's awesome. Like right now, I'm just trying to keep everything realistic because they can't be on track anyway. So if they have that versus having nothing, that's a great option. Okay. Right. I'll reference just a little bit. One of the things I learned, and this is a different kind of area, but this is with an 800-meter runner. I thought I was clever when I first started coaching some 800 runners, and I said, I don't want them to do long runs at all. Okay, that's just, everyone just always seems to get injured, to get these lower body injuries. I want them to do all their aerobic work for an 800 with cross training. So pool, bike, elliptical, stuff like that. And I was having a ton of success all the way up to the 600 meter. And then as soon as they would run an 800, it just was not representative of kind of what they were able to do. So just because something was aerobic, like a bike workout or a pool workout, it wasn't replacing the actual long runs for whatever reason. It just did not work for me. And then when we actually started introducing a bit of mileage, let's just say for these 800 runners, they dropped, in this case, it was a female 800 runner. She was consistently running 212s and 213s, but could run 90 seconds for a 600 and 54 seconds for a 400. As soon as they started giving her mileage, she went from 213 down to 206. So the translation on this to your question is that not everything is a kind of perfect switch over, even like anaerobic work on a bike and stuff. So it's a stopgap, certainly, and something you could do in between races, or if someone has a short-term injury. But actually, one of the things Les Gramanek taught me when I was a young coach, I was asking him about that, of like, hey, what's the best form of cross-training during an injury? And he said nothing. He was like, they're almost better off detraining in that sense, and then rebuilding them back up because you don't want to have the engine of a Ferrari in the body of a Toyota Tercel, right? So anyways, but in this case, in a pandemic, the either or is probably like get them on a bike, get them doing anything. I think that's a great idea, frankly. Yeah, just have them keep moving.
OK, and my last question, thank you for that. Je vais la poser en français parce que je veux être différente. Bon. Cet été, on a trouvé que malgré le fait que, bon, on n'avait pas vraiment les installations pour s'entraîner, on n'avait pas le même calendrier international, on a quand même vu des bonnes performances, voire même des records personnels des athlètes. Puis je veux savoir si toi, ta philosophie de coaching, de programmer, de loader les athlètes, si cette philosophie-là aurait changé compte tenu du fait qu'on a fait la preuve que malgré le fait qu'on était en pandémie, les athlètes étaient quand même capables d'améliorer leur performance.
Yeah, no, good question. Maybe a little bit, maybe a bit more minimalist in terms of like what we really need and things like that, and what's like really important. Like we didn't have a weight room all summer, so, and then I did testing at the end of summer and people tested off the charts. So it's like, is a weight room really that important? And the answer to that is, yeah, I'm sure it still is. I'm sure just because I didn't have it and we were still had some success doesn't mean it's not important. But I think people are resilient and resourceful. So maybe my biggest takeaway of a coach is don't emphasize something as like, this is the most critical thing. We need to do this, because then when you don't have that, the athletes feel like they're missing something. So the athletes are resilient. They're great. They're going to get through on these things. It will be interesting. One of the things that I think is how good are the people who did serious competing this summer, but with improper buildup? How good are they going to be a year from now? Because I think you got different levels of kind of training and training responses that happen, right? So you have the immediate effect of doing a training, and then you have some of these long-term buildups, and then you have stuff that you can kind of carry with you for a long period of time. And all these things you cash out a little bit whenever you start to use them. So are we going to see a drop off this summer, right? So maybe some of what we got to see this summer from people is the training effect of years of training. And so we took it away from them, and then they did less work all summer, and maybe they were just rested and feeling good, and so they performed well. And a year from now that we have this block that's missing, are people still going to be as good? So it's going to be interesting to see.
Interesting. Yeah. OK, merci. Je ferme mon micro.
Merci beaucoup, Bob. Je pense que c'est tout pour le temps qu'on avait. It really was interesting. I'm sure everyone think the same way. Merci pour avoir été aussi très en détail dans les réponses. C'est très apprécié. Je pense qu'on va finir la présentation. Là, je vois Alfredo est en train d'écrire. Ah, merci, Bob. Donc, merci beaucoup. Puis, on est très chanceux de t'avoir eu parmi nous. Je remercie aussi tous les coachs qui étaient présents. Est-ce que, Nana, il y a d'autres informations que tu voulais dire?
Non, pas d'autres informations. Peut-être si, Bob, tu avais des choses à nous partager, comme la documentation écrite, tu peux l'envoyer à moi-même. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll share all that with everybody. Yeah, nothing's proprietary in coaching. It's all everyone does the same stuff.
And if you have old charts from Richard that you would like to share with us, like hurdle touchdown times or things like that Richard told you never to share, but you're going to share now because he's not here, we'd like that.
Written by hand.
No, it's all written by hand. So even when he used to fax me workouts when I was in London. Sometimes.
No, that's the thing. I lost all of those sheets of paper because
I kept them.
I tried to keep them, but I lost them in the move from Sherbrooke. So damn it. Okay.
Is there, Felix Antoine told me about, he wants to know if there's supposed to be something where all the presenters came together. Is there something happening there? Yeah, I don't know. That's I wasn't sure.
No, I didn't hear about that.
Okay. Yeah, so I wasn't sure.
Sorry, Alfredo has something funny to say.
Uh-oh.
Alfredo says you didn't talk about your short 400 hurdle.
No. Yeah, so this is actually a super funny story. As I'm sure you guys are aware, when you're going to Legions, the team is limited in size, so they often ask you to do other events that you've never done before. And so I actually, there's a reason why I got asked to do the 400 hurdles. It was because I showed up late for the 200 and didn't even get to run it. So I won the 400 and was going to represent Quebec for the 400. But they said, this guy's not getting away with one event. He's got to do the 4 hurdles as well. So I show up. I had a good first day. I medaled in the 400, and I think we medaled in either the 4x1 or medley relay or something as well. And then the next morning, I was supposed to do 400 hurdles, and Alfredo was trying to help me. And I think I did one run, and I just flew, and I almost like collapsed and blew my knees out and all of that. And I just walked back and said, nope, not happening. And there was not a word Alfredo could say to me to change my mind, despite his best efforts.
Thank you, this is more about Alfredo's failure as a coach rather than your failure.
Yeah. Well, it probably said something if Richel didn't think it was worth trying to train me over hurdles at any point. So.
Okay, well, thank you again, Bob, and have a great day, everyone.
It's great. Thanks a lot, guys.
Bye. Hopefully see you on a track soon.
Yes, exactly.
Bye.